He's just written a memoir for which I wrote the foreword. But having talked to him, it hasn't come out yet, I learned, and from other sources, I learned what they were really up to. It was not, as Jacob Hornberger, I think, or somebody here on the way in, as I was walking in, said, to defame me. It was to threaten to defame me. They wanted information from a psychoanalyst files. Unfortunately for them, psychoanalysts don't keep notes. But what they wanted was information on me that I wouldn't want out, that they could blackmail me into silence about what? The Pentagon Papers were out by that time, and Nixon was glad of the substance that they were out. They indicted the Democrats. He was very happy with that, as the tapes show. You can see a lot of this, by the way, including the tapes, in the last 3 chapters of my book, Secrets. Didn't know it at the time. What he worried about was that he learned I had documents on his administration. The Pentagon Papers ended in 1968 before he came in. So he liked those. But he feared that I had documents on his administration, and I did, but not as much as he had good reason to fear. He had been making nuclear threats to North Vietnam secretly, no secret to the Russians or the Chinese or the North Vietnamese to whom he conveyed these threats, since 1969, and he yet to make more in 1972. And he didn't want the public to know that. The enemies, yes, but the public might get nervous if they knew he'd been threatening nuclear war, if they didn't meet his terms, which were to get all northern troops out of the southern part of Vietnam, as we withdrew our troops, that they would take their troops out, and thus allow our Saigon regime, General Thieu, to remain in power indefinitely with the help of our Air Force, our air support. His plan was never to allow Saigon to become Ho Chi Minh City. What actually happened was not the fulfillment of what he had in mind in 68 and 69 when he came in. He expected to keep Saigon and the major cities indefinitely, although he was ready to cede control, effective control, of the relatively less populated countryside to the VC, where they control it anyway already. And we keep control of the cities. It would be something like Korea, and that was internally discussed, the Korean solution. Now, Korea, of course, the war was quite different in a number of ways, including a clear demarcation line between our guys and their guys and the adversaries. And it didn't have a guerrilla war going on in South Korea in there, where we've been for the last 6 years. But the idea was that it would be what they called a leopard skin division, not a clear-cut division, and not just at the DMZ, but that a division where they more or less had the relatively less populated countryside, and we had the cities. And a conclusion that would not have been recognized as a clear-cut victory, although by the time he left office, Lyndon Johnson would have given his left arm for that resolution. But no defeat. We'd still be in Saigon. Our flag would be flying alongside the flag for South Vietnam, and indefinitely through 77 and so forth. The way he was going to get that, the problem was that the North Vietnamese were not going to buy that. They were not going to get their troops out, and they were not going to accept the Thieu regime, and they were ready to fight and die indefinitely in any numbers, 10-to-1 losses compared to ours, indefinitely, to prevent that. That's what we were up against for Nixon. Now, that should have been no big surprise by 1969, after the Tet Offensive of 68. But Nixon's theory of how to do that was that by threatening, in the first instance, all-out air attack on North Vietnam, much heavier than Johnson had done, including hitting the dikes, which their calculation would cause from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 1 million deaths, including famine. Hitting all of the bases everywhere, hitting up to the Chinese border, total blockade, and threatening nuclear weapons, for which targets were selected in the Nixon White House. And I talked to Roger Morris, who's written a lot since then, who saw the plans for nuclear targets. One a mile and a half from the Chinese border to send a signal to China in North Vietnam. Nixon was afraid that I had documents, not only knew of all that, which I did in general terms, not all the details, but that I had documents to show it, which I could have had if people who left the NSC over the Cambodian invasion, 5 people left, the only people to resign that I know of during that war, and perhaps any war during the war, in protest against the policy. I knew nearly all of them. I had copied the Pentagon Papers earlier, but they didn't know that. They could have given me those documents. The documents came out, actually, a number of them, just last year. You can look them up on the National Security Archive of George Washington University, NS Archive. Very interesting. Look up for the Duck Hook documents, which is the code name for them. That's last year. That's almost 40 years later. It's been denied up till this point. He feared I had those, and I should have had them in some sense, could have had them for sure. I would say that the people who were ready to end their executive career, or they didn't all end it, but Roger Morris did because he proceeded to be very critical of Nixon, ready to do that, to resign, could have taken documents with them, could have given them to me, or just put them out. They wouldn't have connected me at that time because Pentagon Papers hadn't become public. They could have put them out. Had they done so, I think, in 1969, when they wrote them, the war would have ended a lot sooner. Ended by Congress cutting off the funding for it, which in the end, Congress never did do until the troops were out. But the effect of that, even as late as that, in 1973, and in my trial, the ending of my trial had something to do with that, they did cut off funding at a time when Nixon was about to renew it. In fact, according to Time magazine, he had given the order to renew the bombing in April of 1973. My trial was on at that point. Except that John Dean, who didn't want to be blamed for the whole cover-up, which he had managed, but on orders, revealed to the prosecutor, the Watergate prosecutor, about the break-in to my psychoanalyst office, something that now pointed directly to the Oval Office. None of the other Watergate crimes were ever traced directly to Nixon. To this day, there's no evidence that he knew of the break-in to the Watergate beforehand. Probably he did, but the people who would have known that, like John Mitchell or Haldeman, kept their mouths shut in jail, and it's never come out. What was traceable to him were in particular the crimes against me, and to some extent the rest of the anti-war movement. The break-in, the assault, the overhearing, the wiretaps, CIA, and so forth, all pointed directly to Nixon. That put him in those days in danger of criminal prosecution. And actually, as you'll see in my book from the tape, the first mention of impeachment on the tapes is by Nixon on the day that he was told he had to send John Dean's revelation to my judge. He had held it up for 2 weeks as the trial went on, claiming that it was national security, he didn't have to tell the judge, nothing had been found. And finally, Kleindienst, the acting attorney general, and Peterson, the assistant in terms of criminal prosecution, went to Nixon and said, you have to send it on, that's the law, or we will be liable for obstruction of justice and subject to prosecution for obstruction of justice. So, rather than that, we will resign if you don't send it. Now they threatened to resign. So he sent it on, and on that day, he sent to Kleindienst, make sure the judge knows this is national security, get this true to him. He doesn't have to release it. And then he says to Kleindienst, well, they talk about impeachment. Well, then they get Agnew. How will they like that? And Kleindienst says, Agnew was his impeachment insurance, like Cheney or Quayle, you might say. And then, of course, he lost Agnew to charges of extortion. And there he was, naked, ready to be impeached.